went into an urban location in Nigeria and shot down hundreds of civilians, shot them dead in the streets. That simply didn't happen, right? They obviously carried out assassinations. They killed people, here and there. They killed people in their ones and twos, but it never happened that the military went and carried out a massacre at a toll gate, for example, under a military administration, because they knew that the minute they do that, there are going to be sanctions everywhere, flying up and down, and before the end of the month, they're going to be out of power, basically. But it was the civilian administration that did that and could get away with it, and the world did nothing. So under those kinds of circumstances, or you saw what just happened in Congo, in the DRC, something very similar.
Yeah.
There was a huge massacre. Supposedly, the government in charge in the DRC is a civilian government. It claims to be democratically elected too. The government of Felix Tshisekedi, right? He's not a soldier, and yet the government claims there were 45 people that were shot. We saw the video. The people who were there claim that it's over 100. So let's even go by the official government figures. Let's say the state murdered 45 unarmed civilians, right? And
That's a
we are
lot.
seeing the world's response to this. We are seeing the world's response to this. There is no response. The world is just speaking English. Nothing is going to happen because it's a civilian administration. So if there is a coup tomorrow in the DRC and we see people from that area celebrating, we will not be asking ourselves that how can they be celebrating a military takeover? And then we will not ask ourselves that, well, could it be that what came before the military takeover was so abominable that it could actually be even worse, and that the people are willing to even take their chances with the military? That's what I think people often miss when we're having this conversation, that just because a government is civilian, just because they're wearing agbada, doesn't mean that they are governing or using democratic principles. There are many ways to kill and to subvert a democracy. You don't even have to use open violence to do it the way the military does it. If you are personalizing the institutions of state, you are using corruption to create it and to ensure that the country cannot grow, people's dreams are going to be dashed. You are using state power to ensure that only your cronies and people close to you ever have the opportunity to better themselves in life. If you are distorting the demographics of the country using state power, as has been, like, for example, in Sudan, when
Yeah.
Bashir al-Assad, who
Al-Assad,
claimed to be
yeah.
a civilian,
Yeah.
was using the Sudanese armed forces to carry out a genocide against Black Africans in Darfur. It was artificially distorting the demographics of the country. If you are doing all of that and then there's a coup tomorrow, of course the people will celebrate when there's a coup. So that's the issue. The issue is that the civilians who are in power across Africa, to a very large extent, are actually misbehaving even more than the military that came before them. So we need to have like a whole conversation now about how leadership is even perceived in Africa, that whether military or civilian, because I will confess, I used to be one of those people who thought that the military itself was the problem, that military equals to dictatorship. But based on more recent experience over the past 4 to 5 years, I've come to understand that dictatorship isn't inherent in the military uniform. It's actually inherent in human nature. So civilians are also capable of being dictators as well. They're also capable of being killers. So that leaves us with a much bigger problem. That how do we fix leadership in Africa such that whether it's military, whether it's civilian, whatever it is, how do we make it such that people's basic human rights are seen to have some value and that people's lives are respected? That's where the issue is.
Wow. All right, moving on. This is two-edged, but I'll start with one. Let us look at the imperialist nations, that's the colonial masters. We made a chart. We made a chart which was a French treaty as far back as the 60s that the French people use in administering their colony countries. I don't know whether you can see my screen. The first one says the colonial
Yes, I can.
debt to repay the benefits of colonization. That means colonial debts will be used to repay the benefits of colonization, which means it's the blood, sweat, and tears of the colony countries. Then we have the second one says the automatic confiscation of national and financial reserves. Automatic confiscation of national and financial reserves. Then the third one, the right of first refusal to any raw or natural resource discovered in the country. That third one, let's start with the third one. The first two are very self-explanatory. The third one says the right of first refusal on any raw or natural resources developed in the country, which means that if a raw material is discovered, hypothetically, let's use Niger, for example. The raw material, say titanium, is discovered in Niger. It is the French people that should be reached first. It's when the French people say, okay, you can now, subcontract it, let me use a novice word, to maybe another civilization. That means it is at their exclusive prerogative. These agreements, I don't want to call it agreement because I don't think colony countries have any form of choice whatsoever. So speak to that third part.
So this is, I think, what is one of the things that is central to what is the crisis ongoing in Niger, because basically, if you've been following events, one of the first things that the Nigerians did was that they suspended all exports of uranium to France, and this is problematic to France for two major reasons. First of all, Niger's uranium supplies about 33% of the total electricity supply of France.
Exactly.
First of all. Secondly, and more importantly, which most people don't know, even though France has other sources of uranium, such as Kazakhstan and Canada, the reason why Niger is so strategically important is because whereas in Kazakhstan and Canada, the French companies that mine the uranium are paying royalties of between 18 and 24% to the governments of those countries.
Whereas
in Niger, they are paying 6%.
Wow.
6%. To put that in perspective, in Nigeria, the oil majors that extract oil on behalf of the NNPC, such as Shell and Eni and Ajib, they pay between 40 and 50% royalties. And uranium is far more valuable than oil, by the way. So the Nigerians are getting an absolutely terrible deal. There's no way to sugarcoat it. They are being taken to the cleaners by France. France is being openly predatory here. So the fact that the Nigerian military administration basically suspended exports of uranium to France is causing a huge issue in Paris because their supply of cheap nuclear fuel is gone.
Yeah, and we
if
also
they're paying
and we also hear that the Russians are suddenly interested in the uranium and they want to pay, the standard price, and that is part of the major reasons.
And in addition to paying a standard price, there's also the possibility that the Russians could do something similar to what they did with Nigeria in the 70s and 80s, get into a technical partnership with the Nigerians, possibly even construct a small-scale nuclear power facility there, so that the Nigerians can actually start benefiting from their own uranium, which is exactly what France does not want, right? The vision that France has for its former African colonies is for all of them essentially to remain poor, to remain primary production zones. Their purpose is to give out natural resources, raw, unrefined natural resources. That's the vision that France has for its 14 ex-African colonies. That's things like beneficiation, moving up the value chain, getting into secondary and tertiary production, fourth industrial revolution. It doesn't want those things. The purpose of those countries, as far as France is concerned, is to supply raw materials to France for the exclusive benefit of France. That's how France uses its former colonies in Africa, and that's how France sees itself. In fact, as I'm sure you're aware, there's actually there are several there are several documents in the public domain, official documents from the French government, which basically state openly that without the exploitative relationship that France has with these 14 ex-colonies in Africa, France will cease to be a first world nation. It will cease to be a major global power.
Exactly.
The entire reason France exists as a major global power
because of the
is
colony
because it
countries
lives parasitically of these 14 countries. It's as simple as that. There is no way to sugarcoat it.
Okay, David, I know you have access, or you've had access to a lot of documents that some of us in conventional media may not even have. Ever since I saw this, especially when it came up with Niger, I have been worried because I know Nigeria is a colony under the British Empire. We are still a member of the Commonwealth. Have you come across any document about the agreement We'll get back to the treaty. But have you gotten any document about the agreement with Nigeria and the United Kingdom? Have you seen anything like that?
So, so the well, I don't know if I should call it good luck, but the fortune that the Anglophone countries in Africa have, that's the
Okay.
former colonies of Britain have, is that when the British withdrew, they
Okay.
basically withdrew almost like essentially in full, right? So the British and the Portuguese and the Germans, when they left Africa, they actually left.
But I do,
Obviously, they still
but I
have
do,
some
sorry to
business
interrupt, but
interests here. They still have.
I do not think, I don't think there's any way Nigeria will still not be paying some kind of, colonial royalties to the United Kingdom. Do you think that that has been completely disconnected? Or do we begin to dig
Well, I
and try
mean,
and see?
if if there was ever such a thing, it would definitely have been discontinued in the 70s during the
Okay.
indigenization and nationalization era,
Okay.
when most of the existing British interests then
Yes.
were
Undergo one.
nationalized. So
Yes.
some of our biggest banks today used to be they were British banks back then, and
Yeah.
everything was nationalized under go on. So if there were ever any such agreements, they probably were. I'm not privy to those documents, but if those things ever existed, it was probably in the 70s that all those things came to an end. Which is why I said that the Anglophone countries have a little bit of luck in terms of the fact that, first of all, one insidious thing you've not mentioned about the French relationship with its former colonies is that, in addition to all these other things you've mentioned,
Yeah.
the French education system, which it's inculcated in these colonies, essentially raised people in Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Benin, Chad, DRC, Cameroon to think of themselves as French people, as against Africans. So, unlike in Anglophone Africa, where in Nigeria or Kenya or South Africa, we understand ourselves as what we actually are. There's nobody in Nigeria who thinks that he's a British man.
Exactly.
There's
Yeah.
nobody in Nigeria who uses the term Commonwealth as if it actually means something. Whereas in the so-called France Afrique, that's not the case at all. There are people who have been born and raised in Cameroon. They spent all their lives in Cameroon. They've never left Cameroon. But the French they speak in a Parisian accent. That would be like someone born and raised in Lagos speaking in a
In a
London accent.
pure
That's almost
British
unheard
accent.
of.
Yeah, I get it. I get it.
But
So,
those people, the
yeah.
Francophone Africa has been conditioned to
Hmm.
be so supine that so many of them actually think of themselves as extensions of France. That's the people, not even the government.
All right, because we really we don't have much time again. The fifth one, exclusive right to provide military equipment and train military officers of the colonies. We've seen that. The sixth one is the right for France to deploy troops and intervene military in the country to defend its interest, which means they are also using people from the colonies to go and fight war or to defend their interests. The seventh one is the obligation to make French the official language of the country and the language for education. You just mentioned that it is even far beyond that, because in their psyche they have been programmed to understand that they are not even originally Africans again, they are French. That is where the concept of the France Afrique comes from. Every citizen of the colony of France feels that they are, African French people. Now, the eighth one says the obligation to use the franc, CFA franc, in Africa. I'm sure some countries have discontinued with that. And then you have the ninth one, the obligation to send to France an annual balance sheet. This was where I was coming. And the report on the state of reserves, which means no report, no money. Well, I also understand from that ninth point, I also understand that the monies of the colonies are kept in France and they cannot demand for more than 15%. And that once they demand for more than 15%, it's expected that they will pay interest on their monies being kept in France. David, you must say something about this.
Well, yeah, that's the so-called CFA franc. So there are 14 African countries which. So when you said you are sure that some must have discontinued, no, all 14 African countries that were part of the CFA Union are still part of the CFA Union,
Wow.
unfortunately. So these are the conditions of being part of the CFA franc, that at least 50% of your total foreign reserves are stored with the Banque de France. you essentially have zero control over your fiscal and monetary policy because everything is determined in Paris. As you rightly said, every year you have to basically render an account to Paris. And if you don't render that account and they're not satisfied with it, then basically you don't get access to your money next financial year. And the effect of this, which many people may not know, is that whereas in Nigeria or in Ghana or in Kenya or in South Africa or in most other African countries that are not francophone, even though our currencies are not stable and our governments are irresponsible, but our governments can still act in ways that a sovereign nation can act in. So, for example, when it's time to build a new piece of infrastructure, like the Abuja to Kaduna Railway or the Lagos Ibadan Railway or the Blue Line in Lagos, that sort of thing. These are debt-funded things,
Yeah.
which were majorly financed by the Chinese.
By the
And
Chinese.
Nigeria could enter into that kind of agreement with the Chinese because Nigeria is sovereign. These countries cannot do that because, first of all, France has right of first refusal to building all infrastructure.
Wow.
So, if you want to build a railway in Cote d'Ivoire, France first has to say no, they are not going to do it, but they will let you do it before you can go and meet the Chinese.
That's the
And
implication.
then, if you are going to borrow, like, and then if the Chinese are going to give it to you on the basis they gave it to Nigeria, which is that they'll finance and build it and then you pay them back, which means that you are incurring debt. You have to clear that debt with the Banque de France first.
Wow.
And if the Banque de France says no, they're not going to let you borrow that money. You can't borrow it, so you can't build that infrastructure. End
Wow.
of story.
Wow.
So essentially, these countries are not independent yet. They have flag independence, they have elections, but they are not yet sovereign because they are still subject to a foreign power.
Okay, final question on the rising wave of coup. Which seems to have impacted more, Mr. David? Is it the corruption in leadership and the quest never to want to leave that position of power in the case of African leaders? Or is it the colonial influence that has shaped, you know, the direction, the statute, the future of each colony countries, which has impacted on African countries more?
I would argue that actually so it's a bit of a chicken and egg question, to be honest. But the most immediate cause is definitely the African governments themselves and the power hunger, you know, and the greed of African leaders after independence. That's the most immediate cause. However, when you zoom out, you almost inevitably find that even though it's not always obvious, there are always people in the background who made it possible for these very unsuitable characters to come into power and to stay there. There's always a reason why those people are able to stay in power for that long. So for example, Mobutu
Yeah,
in
Sese
then
Seko,
Zaire, now
Congo
known as
Zaire.
DRC. The reason Mobutu could stay in power that long was because he had all sorts of foreign backing. So where his own people were not backing him, foreign powers were backing him. So, and that's the tragedy, I think, of the post-colonial African states, that the will of the people is not respected by their leaders, but it's also not respected even by the
By the
international
foreign
community that is
powers.
always talking about democracy and will of the people. So that's the problem. So it's a bit of it. That's why I say it's a chicken and egg question. Because yes,
I can
the
relate.
immediate cause
Yeah,
is the bad leaders who are there, but
yeah,
there's always somebody who puts the bad leaders there. That's
yeah.
the issue.
And stands behind them. You know, we've seen a lot of
Exactly.
countries, you know, that people complain about the leadership style, how be it dictatorship or authoritarian. We've seen those leaders travel abroad and are given carte blanche treatment, red carpet treatment, as if,
Red carpets.
yes, as if they have, you know, legitimacy. Whereas they, the Western powers, are saying they are spending so much in billions to try and entrench and deepen democracy. So it's a bit of an irony. I quite agree with you. All right, if you're just tuned in, it's Political Spectrum on Spectrum Television. I've been speaking to the erudite and the ever sagacious David Hundeyin. We'll go on a short break. Thereafter, we'll be back to, with the small time we have left, we'll try and just look at President Tinubu's 100 days in office. Remember, tomorrow will be exactly 100 days. I'd like to get David's opinion. Stay tuned. Join us again.
Business exists only to meet the needs of the people. But there's an extra advantage if your product and services are pitched on a platform that gives you the added advantage over your competitors. For your desired return on investment and so much more, advertise on Spectrum Television, on StarTimes DTH Channel 421 and on free-to-air with a frequency of 12733. Spectrum Television, broadening your horizon.